Perry Jr. was here. He was healthy and the Mason household was now full. Della sat on the bed and looked at the little baby that she and Perry had made together. He looked like his daddy with great big eyes that reminded her so much of her Perry. Sally was with her aunt once more. She woke up in her old room. She had been happy there, but she had known that her Aunt Michelle was too old to take care for her. She had been sad when she had left that day. It seemed like it had been such a long time ago. She now lived her new mom and dad. She missed her mommy and daddy from before. Michelle was down in the kitchen making some breakfast when Sally came down. She was a breath of fresh air to their home, and as she offered her niece breakfast, she told her of her plans. "We don't get to see each other very much. Once we have breakfast and get dressed, I have some place that I would like to take you. But, I want to know your thoughts on the matter," she told her as she handed her a bowl of cereal. Sally was intrigued and asked her, "Where do you want to take me?" Michelle turned away from the stove and smiled at her niece. "I would like you and me to make a trip to the cemetery where your mom and dad are. What do you think?" she asked her. Sally thought for a moment. She missed her first mommy and daddy every day. She had been happy with them. Her mommy and daddy Mason had told her that they would always be her birth parents. But because they could not be there for her childhood, her parents would want her to be happy. Sally wanted to say hello to her first parents very much. Her mommy had offered to take her once, but she had said no. She didn't want to upset her. But with her Aunt Michelle it was different. Her aunt knew her parents. She smiled and said, "Yes, I would like to go with you. Can I bring flowers?" "Yes, you can. We will go and see the baby and then go to the cemetery. After that we can grab a lunch. Your Uncle Brian and your Aunt Mary are coming over tonight for supper," Michelle told her. Sally was excited. She hadn't seen her Aunt Mary or Uncle Brian in months and she had missed them. "I can't wait. I miss Brian and all his girlfriends." "Is Aunt Mary coming over with her kids?" "Yes, everyone is coming over. We are going to have a barbecue." Michelle smiled. Sally got very excited and hurried to get dressed. As her Aunt Michelle and she went to the hospital, she was full of energy. She missed her mommy and couldn't wait for Perry Jr. to come home. She got to hold the baby and kissed her mommy and daddy hello. Della looked at the little girl who was the light of her life. Sally had come to their home to live for a short time and had won their hearts. Now she couldn't picture life without her. As Della looked up, she smiled. Perry had come into the room. Perry leaned over and gave all three of them a kiss. "Good morning." Perry had spent the night in the room with his new family, but had stepped out to pick up a bouquet of roses. He had wanted to purchase 5 dozen roses, but thought that he could have them waiting for his wife when she got home. Della asked Sally, "What are you doing today?" Sally smiled and told her, "I am going with Aunt Michelle to see my first parents' grave. Then we are having a barbecue with my Uncle Brian and my Aunt Mary and all of her kids at Aunt Michelle's," she told her. Della gave Perry a quick look and smiled. "Well, you have a good time. Perry Jr. and I will be home tomorrow," she told her. "What time?" Sally squealed. "We will call you when we find out. Is that all right with you, Michelle?" Michelle smiled and said, "Of course it is." The rest of the visit was friendly and Sally left skipping down the hallway. She could not wait to show her new brother his room. She and her mommy had worked hard on making his room nice. As Michelle and Sally arrived at the cemetery, Sally started to look for the stone that had her mommy and daddy's name on it. She found the stone with names Nora and Robert Capron. She placed the flowers there and said a little prayer. She missed them and remembered that day. "I love you," she told them. "Please remember me. I love my new parents too. I am very happy." Michelle nearly broke down in tears as she watched her niece acting like such an adult. She was a good person who loved everyone. She did not deserve to have what happened to her. Larry Barber had been the Masons' landscaper ever since they had bought the house. The home was a lovely home in an exceptionally nice part of town. The lady of the house always left him fresh lemonade in the refrigerator in the pool house. They treated him very well. But Larry was having marital problems. His wife was seeing another man. She had admitted to it. He had taken her back, but was having some issues just the same. Tonight he was going to marriage counseling and he hoped that would help. As he worked on the lawn, he whistled to himself. The Masons were such nice people and Perry had asked him to do an especially good job today because he was bringing a new baby home the next day. Back at the Jones house, Sally was busy helping her Aunt Michelle get ready for the company. She got the plates and silverware out and then mixed the lemonade. Her mommy made the best lemonade and she had learned from her how to crush the lemon and to mix it very well. Michelle smiled at her niece who was becoming a young lady. She was really being a help. That night Sally and her aunts and uncles all had a good time. Sally had only met Aunt Mary's new husband a couple of times and was glad to get to see him again. But he was not that friendly and was drinking a lot of beer. Sally heard her Uncle Brian say something, but he had just brushed him off. Uncle Steve was not that nice and Sally wasn't sure if she liked him or not. But Sally got the chance to get to see her cousins and they had a good time. "We thought that you didn't want to have anything to do with us now that you are living with the rich," cousin Danny told her. Sally couldn't understand why she was treated like that by her cousins. But she still had lots of fun and enjoyed the time with her Aunt Michelle. The next morning her daddy called. Perry Jr. was coming home at 12. He was going to be picking her up at 11 so they could go and get her mommy and baby brother. Chapter 2. At 11 that morning Sally was picked up by her daddy. Her Aunt Michelle had dressed her very cute and she was happy to be going home. Perry thanked the lady and the daughter and father left hand in hand with Sally skipping. Michelle Jones smiled as she watched her niece go off with her new daddy. She thought of her brother and his wife. They had been such good parents to Sally and she knew that they would have wanted Sally to go with the Masons. The Mason family had been wonderful to Sally and she truly loved them very much. Picking up baby Perry was a big day in the life of the Mason family. Perry had his new camera and taped everything. Della was so tired when she got home, all she wanted to do was sleep. For the first few weeks the baby was going to sleep with her and Perry in his bassinet. Sally made sure that her mommy was all set and then went downstairs to let her mommy and brother have a little time to rest. Della was hoping that it would be slow in the office for the next couple of weeks. She was looking forward to getting back to work once the baby was 6 weeks old. But, right now she was very tired and fell right to sleep. Perry was in his study and kept the baby monitor on. He hadn't heard Sally in a few minutes and so he went out and called her name. There was no answer. He went up to her room and did not find her. He slowly opened the door to his bedroom where Della and Perry Jr. were sleeping and found no Sally. Now Perry was not one to panic but he wondered where she was. He went out into the yard and walked all around. She was not there. He saw Hamilton Berger's brother and asked him if he had seen her. "No. I'm sorry, we just got back from shopping." Perry went back into the house and checked everywhere. He could find no Sally. Now he was worried. Sally had been in the kitchen getting herself something to eat when her Uncle Steve had knocked on the door. He had a new video game for her and said that Aunt Michelle wants you to come with me. We are going up to Mommy and Daddy's cabin, the one you used to go to with your real parents. Sally wasn't sure, but Aunt Michelle was her friend. Sally started to turn around and Larry, the guy that cut their lawn, said, "It's okay, I already talked to your daddy and he said you could stay with Aunt Michelle for a little longer." With that Sally had left with the two men happily, thinking that everything was all right. But it wasn't. She was being kidnapped and was headed out to the woods with no way to call anyone. She would not have any fears for quite a while yet. but Perry was becoming extremely concerned and thought about waking Della up. What good will that do? All she could do was worry. I will call Paul, he thought to himself. Paul knew that the police would not get involved yet, but he still contacted a friend of his on the police force and came right over. He found Perry a nervous wreck and himself walked the entire property in and out. There was no sign of Sally. There was no sign that she had been forced out of the house either. The two men started walking the street and asked every single neighbor if they had seen anyone. No one had, and they had not seen Sally that day either. As Perry and Paul arrived back at the house, they found Della in the kitchen getting herself a drink of coffee. She turned to smile at her husband and Paul and knew something was wrong, very wrong. She looked into the two men's eyes and said, "What is wrong?" Perry took his wife, the woman he loved more than he had ever thought he could love, in his arms and told her, "I don't know where Sally is. Paul and I have been looking for the past hour. We have walked the house many times and the neighborhood as far as the school. No one has seen her." Della's life stopped right there. Who would take Sally? She was just 9 years old. There were no signs in the house that indicated that she was in trouble. She cried out and said, "We need to call the police." That afternoon Perry Mason did call the police. The police came over and searched every inch of the house and the land. They too went up and down the street asking questions and looking in places that a small child could hide. But they were unsuccessful also. Meanwhile Sally was with her Uncle Steve and the lawn man. She remembered the way to her mommy and daddy's cabin. She had many good memories there and couldn't wait to see her cousins and her Aunt Michelle. But as they arrived at the cabin, there wasn't anyone there. Her uncle shrugged his shoulders and told her that they would be there soon. Sally went into the back bedroom that had always been hers and went over and started playing her new video game. She could hear Larry and her uncle in the front room talking to another man. It seemed as though they were arguing. As she stepped out into the living room, she saw that her Uncle Steve and Larry were drinking with another man, and when they saw her they told her to go back into her room. Sally didn't like that her aunt and cousins hadn't shown up. She picked up the phone to call her Aunt Michelle and found no dial tone. She would call them from the living room when everyone else went to bed. Back at the Mason house, both Paul and Perry were in full investigative mood. Della just sat there holding Perry Jr. and stared. Someone had taken little Sally and now they had to wait for a call from the kidnappers. She was sure that they would want money. Chapter 3. Sally sat in her room and waited for someone to come to the house. She listened as her uncle and the gardener talked out in the living room. But no one came. Where were her cousins and her aunt? She decided to go out into the living room and ask them what was going on, but to her shock the door to her room was now locked. She couldn't get out. She knocked and yelled, but her Uncle Steve or Larry Barber, but no one answered. As Sally walked around the room, she checked out the window. Her room was very high for her to jump from. Although she was on the first floor, there was a gully behind the house and the drop to the gully was at least 20 feet. She looked around for something that she could use for a rope or something and could find nothing. The next morning Steve went to Sally's room and opened the door. He found her asleep on the floor in front of the door. She had slept there, and when he woke her up he could see that she had been crying. He looked down at her and told her, "Why all of the tears? Your Aunt Michelle and Aunt Mary will be here today. They are just a little late." Sally looked at her uncle. She wanted to believe him, but... "Why did you lock my door last night?" she asked as she walked toward the kitchen to get some breakfast. "I didn't want you wandering around. The woods are dangerous and dark," he told her. Sally looked around and didn't see Larry. The car was gone too. She knew that it was at least 3 miles to the nearest cabin, and during this time of year, there probably wouldn't be anyone there. As she was finishing her breakfast, she saw Larry coming back. Her Uncle Steve went out to the car to meet him. Sally could see that they were talking, maybe even arguing. This was one of the times that Sally knew she had a few moments to check things around. She had seen on television how you could use a nail file to open a locked door, and she knew that her mother had one in the bathroom. She was going to take it and hide it in her room. She went into the bathroom and found the file. As she left the bathroom, her Uncle Steve and Larry came into the cabin. Sally smiled at the two men and they smiled back at her. She went into her room to get dressed. There she hid her nail file under the mattress and went back into the living room. She spent the day watching movies. There was no cable at the cabin, but she had a recorder that she could watch. She looked at some of the movies that she and her mommy and daddy had watched together many times and felt like crying. If Sally was going to escape from the room, she was going to have to be very quiet. She had her clothes all ready and made sure that her sneakers and everything were ready for the long walk. The woods were dark and dangerous. She had been out there many times, but never alone. Meanwhile, Larry had been to a town 100 miles away and had called the Mason household. He had demanded a ransom of $100,000. It was supposed to be paid in small bills, and he had said that he would call back in 3 days. Perry had taken the call and recorded the whole thing. His hands shook as he placed the phone on the receiver. His fears were now confirmed. Sally had been kidnapped. He had the phone number and Paul traced it to a phone booth about 80 miles away. It was a long shot, but at least he had something. He contacted the police and they came out. The sergeant listened to the tape. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked. Perry told him that no, it had been disguised. That day the gardener was going to be there and they would ask him if he heard anything. Della had been up all night crying, and now to hear that Sally had been definitely kidnapped, she was terrified. Back at the cabin, the two men knew that they were going to have to leave Sally alone. Larry was going to have to go to the Mason home and act like nothing was happening, and if Steve did not get back to his home, Mary would begin to wonder. He had called Mary and had told her that he had car trouble and was spending the night at Larry's. She had offered to come and get him, but he had politely refused. Within 2 hours Sally found herself alone in the cabin. Something told her that she was definitely going to be alone, maybe forever. She was scared to death. The weather was good though, and she thought that if she was careful, she could make it to the town before dark. Once she made sure that her Uncle Steve and Larry were truly gone, she headed out. She walked in the woods, keeping an eye on the road so she wouldn't get lost, and that worked at first. But then she had seen a deer and had followed it for a short while. Sally turned and she couldn't find the road. Now, she was scared, very scared. The woods went on for miles, her daddy had told her. She had only brought a few things to eat and it would get cold soon. Meanwhile, Larry and Steve had gone home. Larry had been questioned by the police and was glad to find out that he wasn't a suspect. He told them that he had seen nothing and had gone through his work just like any other day. Steve talked to his wife Mary. She was very upset. Apparently someone had kidnapped her niece, little Sally. They wanted a ransom of all things. Steve had told her how sad and said, "I am going to go out and find her. I will let you know what I found out." Mary had protested, but he had insisted and she had given in. Steve and Larry genuinely wanted to help out with the search for Sally. Larry knew her because he was the gardener for the little girl's parents. Larry and Steve were quite proud of themselves. They had bought themselves some time and soon they would be very wealthy. All they had to do was to keep Sally happy. As they pulled up to the cabin, they carried a new toy for the little girl. But, as they walked in, they soon discovered that Sally had left. In the meantime, it had gotten dark out and Sally was very lost. She had no flashlight or anything and curled up next to a tree. Thank goodness she had brought her favorite blanket with her. She also had an apple, and as she ate it she sat there and cried. Chapter 4. Now it was time for panic. Steve and Larry were beside themselves. Where on earth could Sally be? No one had seen them except the semi-hermit that lived down the road. He was not talking. He thought that Steve and Larry were just friends of the poor people that had died in the car accident a year or so ago. He had not seen Sally. They had made sure of that by locking her bedroom door. Jim Burns enjoyed the quiet life of living in a small cabin without lights or plumbing up in the woods. But even he had to go into town once in a while. This day he needed some supplies and had walked the near to 5 miles into town. As he picked up some supplies, he heard the news of little Sally. He remembered the little girl as full of life. He had been so sad when her parents had died in that awful crash. He thought that her life would have been fine after she was adopted by Perry Mason. In his many years as a businessman he had met and made friends with Perry and Della. They were good people and he wanted to help find the little girl, but he had no idea what or who would take her. As Jim made the long trip back to his cabin he went by the old Capron place. There was something strange about the two men who had been up there, and so he decided to go and say hello to them once again. There had been video games out as though a child had been there playing. Oh no, that couldn't be, as he thought of Sally. Jim took a peek inside the window and to his dismay saw 2 bodies lying on the floor. Both the men who he had been talking to just the other day were dead. He went in and checked to make sure, but they had been shot. Jim was tired, but hurried as fast as he could to get to the nearest phone. He met with the police and took them up to the cabin. The police asked him a lot of questions and he wondered for just an instant if he was a suspect. But he had no reason to murder these 2 men. Meanwhile Sally had gotten up. She was hungry and very tired. The night had not been a good one. The sounds of the animals and the fact that it was dark and she was lost had not led to a good night's sleep. But as she walked this morning she heard the sound of water and so she followed the sound. By mid-morning she had found the water and took a long drink. She was very thirsty. But she remembered something her daddy had told her a long time ago. One day when she and her other mommy and daddy had been out in the woods, her daddy had said, "Sally, if you ever get lost in the woods and find water, you are safe. Follow the flow of the water. It will take you to civilization almost all of the time." This was the first time that Sally had hope, and so she started the long walk along the water. Sometimes she couldn't follow the water all of the way, but she made sure that she could always hear the water. She walked for hours and it was again getting dark. All she had left for food was a few chips, but she had water. This night, she slept again against a tree. Meanwhile the police were checking out the 2 men who had been found murdered in the cabin. They were 2 men from the Los Angeles area and one of them was indeed the brother-in-law of Bob and Nora Capron. But they had found something in one of the bedrooms. It was a sweater and neatly inside had been sewn in the name Sally Mason. Even in this small town news had gotten around that Sally Mason had been kidnapped. The police chief shook his head. Did these 2 fools kidnap the little Capron girl? If they did, where was she? Perry and Paul had been doing everything they could to find Sally. Della was just beside herself and could not stop holding the baby when they got the call. It was the police from Wood Valley. They were at a cabin that had once belonged to Sally's parents and there had been a murder. Sally's uncle and a man named Larry Barber. We found a pink sweater with the name Sally Mason tagged on the inside. That was his gardener's name. He got the address from the police and said that he was on his way. Perry turned to Della and told her they just found Sally's uncle Steve and our gardener Larry murdered in Sally's parents' cabin. They found Sally's sweater at the cabin. And I think that Sally's uncle Steve and our gardener got together and kidnapped Sally. There is only one problem, Sally is nowhere to be found, he told Della as he put his arms around her. The tears were in his eyes as they were in hers. Perry told her tenderly, I am going to go get Paul and head right up there. As soon as I found out anything I will call. He then kissed his wife and his newborn son and hurried out the door. Sally had been walking for hours when she saw a house in the valley. This looked like a home, a regular home, and she went down towards the house very carefully. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. A dog came running up with his tail wagging and she pet him. It was the first time in what seemed forever that she felt all right. She stood there at the door and no one answered. She looked around and could see that there was no one at home. She thought that she might get in trouble if she went in. But, she would tell the people what had happened. She reasoned it would be all right. Sally tried the door and found it unlocked. As she went in, she saw a house with signs that there were children living in it. She hoped that this meant that she would be safe. She went into the living room and picked up the phone. She thought, Daddy's at work, I will call the office. She did and got the answering service. So she left them a message. The lady at the answering service was brand new and knew nothing about the kidnapping and placed the information that Sally had given her into a pile of messages that were accumulating for Perry Mason. For some reason he had not been picking them up like he usually did. Sally, in the meantime, was very hungry and looked in the refrigerator. There she found ham and cheese and made herself a sandwich. Her mom and dad would pay them back when they picked her up, she reasoned. Perry and Paul were on their way up to the cabin as fast as they could. They were both worried that Sally might be lost in the woods. In the meantime, Sally fell asleep on the couch of the stranger's home, safe for the time being. Chapter 5. For Perry Mason, who had contacted his friend Paul Drake, the ride up to the old cabin was too long. Where was Sally? There were 2 dead men in the cabin and Sally was not there. Thank goodness that Paul was driving, for Perry was in no shape to do so. Della was sitting at the kitchen table trying to think. Someone had kidnapped Sally and then taken her to the cabin. She had called Sally's Aunt Mary. The poor lady was devastated. Her husband had told her that he was going to go and find Sally if he and his friend Larry could do so. He had left just that day looking for her. They must have stumbled across the kidnapper and lost their lives. But where was Sally? She couldn't be with the murderer. Oh no, that cannot be, Della thought to herself. Meanwhile, Gloria Statler had finally gotten a break at work. She was watching the television where they were carrying a story of a little girl who had been kidnapped. Her name was Sally Mason. Gloria thought of the call that she had received a few hours ago. The call was from a child by the name of Sally and she had wanted to talk to Mr. Mason. She had not taken down any information because the girl did not have the phone number where she could be reached. At the time she had thought it was a prank. Gloria just about ran out of the room. She went to her desk and found the slip that she had started to fill out. She had not written down the time or anything, just a message saying Sally. She went over to her supervisor. The supervisor couldn't believe what Gloria had handed her. She placed a call to the police immediately. Lt. Tragg, who usually worked homicide, was very concerned about the Mason case. Sally was a sweetheart and she had been kidnapped. Now her sweater had been found in the cabin along with 2 murder victims. He was thinking hard and trying to figure out where she was when he heard the phone call. A girl by the name of Sally had placed a call to the Mason answering service. Lt. Tragg went over to the phone and asked that he could go with the detectives to the answering service. As the men went over to the center, they talked to a lady named Gloria who had taken the call. The supervisor was busy going through the phone records. They had caller ID and should be able to pick up the phone number. In the meantime, the police had been in contact with the telephone company to get the name and address of the person who had called the center sometime between the hours of 10 and 11 that morning. Unfortunately, the center handled over 200 calls an hour and they had been very busy on that day. This was going to take time. The best thing for them was to get the number from the center itself. Lt. Tragg took it upon himself to go through the records. Finally, after many hours of looking, they had come across a telephone number that was just 12 miles from the cabin where Sally's uncle and his friend had been murdered. Could a 9-year-old girl make it 12 miles on her own? he thought to himself. Yes, he thought that she might be able to. Sally woke up in the strange house. No one was home and she looked around. The house was a nice old home and there was 2 bedrooms upstairs. She looked at the pictures on the wall and saw a mother, father and 2 girls. She looked at the time and saw that it was almost 3 in the afternoon. She reasoned that there was a road to the house now and it was time for her to walk into town. As she was starting to get her backpack and get ready to go onto the road, she heard the sound of a car coming into the driveway. Oh no, they might be angry that I came into the house. I ate some of their food, she thought to herself. With that she ran and hid in the hall closet. Jenny and Carl Wheeler had been at work all day and were tired. Their 2 girls, Danielle and Brenda, ran ahead. But when they walked in the house they were surprised. Someone had been there. There was a plate out where someone had made a sandwich and there was a backpack on the couch. They each ran out and got their parents. Jenny was surprised and as she looked around she was sure that she heard something in the closet. As she opened the door there stood Sally. She was dirty, but otherwise all right. Jenny took her hand and led her out into the living room. She smiled at the little girl and all of the others starting asking her tons of questions. The girl was scared and Jenny hushed the rest of the family. Don't be afraid, my name is Jenny Wheeler and this is my husband Carl and my 2 children Danielle and Brenda. Can you tell me your name? She asked as tenderly as she could. Sally looked at the 4 people who were standing in front of her and knew that she needed to trust someone. They might be able to call her mommy and daddy and then they could come and get me. She looked at them and said, my name is Sally Mason. Jenny nearly fainted. This was the little girl who was all over the news. She had been kidnapped and was missing. They had found her sweater up in a cabin a few miles away. There had been 2 men murdered there and she needed to call the police. Can you help me find my mom and dad? I called them, but the answering lady said that she could not help me because I didn't know your phone number. I am sorry that I used your phone, but I was trying to call my daddy. Jenny took the young girl in her arms and told her, you are safe now. We will call your daddy and then the police. All right, she smiled. Sally thought that maybe her mommy would be home. She might be sleeping but her nanny would be there. So she called the house. Della heard the phone ring and jumped up. She had been waiting for a call for hours. She picked up the phone. It was Sally. She was all right and at a house that belonged to people with the name of Jenny and Carl Wheeler. Words cannot express the feelings that Della had at that moment. Her little girl was safe and sound. She had to call Perry. Oh Sally, we have been so worried, but Daddy is just a little bit away from you and I will call him. I promise he will be there shortly. But just then Sally heard a car door and getting out of the car was her daddy. He had found her. She ran to him and he grabbed her and held her up in the air, tears flowing down his tender eyes. Sally was safe and he was never going to let her out of his sight again. Jenny told Della what was happening and as Della waited, Perry got on the phone and told her that everything was all right, that Sally was fine. Chapter 6. Lori and Della were finally able to breathe for the first time in days. Lori had come over to stay with her sister when she had called and told her about the kidnapping. Lori never wanted to go through anything like that again. Della found herself wringing her hands and crying for joy now. But Perry was busy with the police. There were lots of questions to be answered. Sally was very young and had been traumatized, but there were 2 men who had been murdered at the cabin and he needed to know what she knew. As Perry held his daughter in his arms, he asked her if her Uncle Steve and Larry had been good to her. He thought that if she had seen them murdered that she would tell him then. Oh, they were all right. They had lots of movies for me to watch and they bought me a video game. But they kept telling me that Aunt Michelle and my cousins were coming and I didn't believe them, she told him. Perry took a breath and realized that she didn't seem to know that her uncle and that terrible gardener were dead. But he asked her as casually as possible, when was the last time that you saw them? Sally was worried that she might be in trouble. She had left for a walk to town. She was afraid of her uncle and Larry for some reason. But she loved her daddy and knew that she should tell him the truth. "How did you leave?" he asked her. "I was alone in the cabin after they left to go into town. I had meant to follow the road, but stay in the woods in case they came back. But I got lost and couldn't find the road. I walked and walked until I found the river. My other daddy had told me that if I followed the flow of the water I would find people. I slept in the woods under a tree and walked today until I saw this house," she told him. Sally was safe and that was all that mattered, but the last time that she had seen her uncle and Larry they had been alive. "Do you know what time it was when they left yesterday?" he asked her. "It was early, I was still eating breakfast," she told him. Perry had to find out these things. There was murderer out there someplace. "Sally, did anyone else ever come to the cabin while you were there?" he asked her. "Yes, there was a man that came and it seemed as though they were arguing. But when I walked into the living room they made me go back to my room. I couldn't see him very well because I was sent back to my room too quick. So I peeked through the door lock," she told him. "Then there was the man that was talking to them out in the driveway. They were talking for a few minutes and then he walked up the road." Perry was still holding Sally in his arms and asked her, "Did you see that man? Would you recognize him if you saw him again?" "Oh yes, he didn't see me, but I saw him from the window. Uncle Steve said his name, it was Hermit." Perry knew right away who the man was. He had known Jim Burns for years and he was the man that had found the two men murdered. Things did not look good for his friend either. "Did anything else happen while you were there?" he asked her. Sally just shook her head and said, "I hope you don't mind, but I took my old backpack and favorite blanket from the cabin." That just made Perry hold her tighter. As they went back to LA it was a much merrier mood. Paul Drake did not think that he had ever been as worried as he had been the past few days. But, Sally was all right and life was good once more. Della had called Michelle Jones. She was upset, very upset with Michelle's nephew-in-law, but knew that Michelle was now grieving. Someone had murdered the man and there was now the grieving process that was happening at Michelle's house now. Michelle Jones could not believe what Steve had done. She would have killed him herself if she had known what he had done. Sally had been through so much for a young girl of only 9. But, she was now relieved to find out that Sally was fine. She was now on her way to Mary's house to see what she could do to help her. She couldn't help but wonder how Mary was handling her husband's murder and the fact that he and his friend Larry had been the kidnappers. The kidnappers that everyone had been looking for was her husband and his friend Larry. They had not been out looking for the kidnapper, they had been hiding the little girl in the cabin that Bob and Nor had once owned. As Michelle pulled up to Mary's home she was met by her children. The house didn't seem very solemn. In fact, if Michelle hadn't known any better, she thought that Mary wasn't very upset about her husband. As Michelle spent the day with the family she was wondering if Mary had known about the kidnapping. It was just the way that she had been acting. But she reasoned to herself, people handle grief in different ways. Finally the police statements were done and Perry and Sally along with their friend Paul Drake headed back out to their home. As the car pulled into the Mason driveway, Della came running out of the house and took Sally in her arms. Lori stood there with tears in her eyes, and as the family went up the stairs to their home they felt safe once again. But for Jim Burns things were not going well. The police had finished their investigation and had shown up at his cabin late that afternoon. He was under arrest under suspicion of murder and he needed a lawyer. Things were not going to be quiet at the Mason household for long.